Good day.
Good day.
First of all, I'm particularly grateful to Ilona Katsiu, both for organizing this extraordinary exhibit of a whole collection of Gasta paintings, and also for inviting me to come here. My first contact with the Gasta paintings was precisely thanks to Ilona, because I had worked now 30 years ago about 19th century Cuba, sexuality and racism, but I hadn't been aware of the existence of these extraordinary portraits of colonial society. What I want to do, well, I will do it rather than talk, summarize in advance. But first of all, what I've done is bring you a document which is contemporary with the Gasta paintings, and it belongs there. You have it on the wall. I don't know whether can you read it back there. It's by Dr. Tembra, a jurist, precisely at the time of the Gasta paintings. I have brought this document about unequal marriages precisely because it seems to me that it is the background, or one of the backgrounds against which we ought to view critically, to contemplate and to think about the Gasta paintings. This document, I think, is extraordinary, and it's probably quite exceptional in the sense that it does show explicitly in colonial society the persistent intersection between racial, social hierarchy, the valuation or devaluation of women's sexuality, and gender relations. We talk a lot about race, class, and gender, or gender, class, and race, but it is very rare to find historical documents which show so explicitly the absolutely indissociable connection between these diverse dimensions of the socio-political process in colonial society. Second, having been yesterday afternoon at the exhibit, I just want to point out 2 or 3 things regarding the paintings which drew my attention. Particularly the fact, and again the document I think is the background, the fact that it seems to me that these are, and Ilona has already stressed it, these are idyllic depictions of the local social and economic panorama in the 18th century in Mexico. I understand that there are also Gasta paintings drawn in Lima and in Quito. It would be interesting to compare them. Idyllic in the sense that, with the exception of one indigenous wedding and one painting where apparently there is a marital ring exhibited, on the whole, we don't know how these couplings and reproductions come about. Nothing is projected or is shown about the fact that the majority of the unions between, as Theo said at the beginning, between usually higher socio-racially placed men with lower women occurred outside of wedlock. Therefore, one of the issues which must be dealt with, together with the social gradation of statuses, is the question of illegitimacy. A person in the colonial world was not only classified according to his or her phenotypical status or legal race, which was another mechanism in a world so diffused by then in terms of clear phenotype, but the added and indispensable criterion was also whether a person was of legitimate or illegitimate status. Here the point is precisely that in cases of couples where the social distance is considered to be excessive, marriage is out. And these were the majority of the cases. So it seems to me that illegitimacy and legitimate birth is absolutely fundamental. It is also significant that precisely in the 18th century, this is research done by Patricia Twinham, with applications for a declaration of legitimacy by colonial people, these applications increase substantially. There's a growing concern over the blurring of phenotypical boundaries, and at the same time, the fact that it is therefore easier to subvert or to pass as white. Well, these are my introductory remarks. And the last characteristic which I thought caught my attention about the paintings, there are two things. It is interesting that the exhibit in Spanish is called La Invención del Mestizaje, but since mestizaje is not translatable, save in the technical term miscegenation, which is very academic, therefore the English title is La Invención, the invention of race. So this is a very significant slippage for comparative studies. Why isn't there a word for mestizaje in English? There are the half-castes, the Anglo-Egyptians, the Anglo-Indians and so on. These are other categories which I think we have to analyze comparatively. Well, the Spanish colonial empire and its Portuguese counterpart were the pioneers in European expansion into Africa and America. This is very important to emphasize because the so-called post-colonial studies tend to think that the British and the French invented modern colonialism. Until 1815, Spain and Portugal not only overshadowed Europe's overseas expansion, but they taught the old world how to conquer and colonize huge territories in the New World and make their vast natural and human resources profitable. The Spanish colonies in Mexico and Peru were the first mixed colonies in which a minority of Iberian settlers created an entirely new, hitherto unknown type of society composed of a whole range of unfamiliar categories of peoples, which resulted from the subjugation of the indigenous population and of huge contingents of Negro slaves imported from Africa, and, not to forget, the sex-through exploitation of their women. The foremost aim of the colonial enterprise was no doubt personal profit and national wealth. But at a time when religion was inseparable from politics, the Catholic Church played as important a role as the crown in shaping Spanish-American colonial policy and the interrelationships with the hitherto unknown indigenous peoples and the rapidly growing contingent of African slaves. A transatlantic perspective is indispensable to comprehend the interplay between metropolitan administrative principles and spiritual, religious, and social values that gave rise to the new kinds of peoples. The Catholic Church's universalist moral code explicitly linked virginity and chastity of women, family honor, and social preeminence in accordance with the religious doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. But that blood was another blood than the one today. The doctrine of limpieza de sangre structured social identities and hierarchies politically, morally, and symbolically, as well as the manner of their reproduction in the metropolis, but also posed new political and conceptual dilemmas in the emerging colonial society in view of the growing population of mixed peoples. I think in the Cuadros de Castas there is a persistent insistence on becoming. A woman and a man hacen, tienen fruto, dan fruto, they produce, they engender. And I think this dimension of engendering is fundamental. Ethnic mixture was no novelty for the Spanish colonizers. The unfamiliar socio-ethnic categories that arose from the colonial encounter stood in contradiction, however, with late medieval metropolitan ideals of bounded corporate social honors and preeminence and discriminations. At first, the colonizers drew on familiar metropolitan cultural notions to make sense of the American reality. With time, the unprecedented social dynamics of colonial society transformed metropolitan notions of nobility, social honors and hierarchy, the family and sexual morality. Central among metropolitan social cultural values was the theological doctrine of limpieza de sangre that structured late medieval Iberian society. The notion of limpieza de sangre was informed by a genealogical ideology which rooted social honors and status in legitimate birth as proof of pure blood, predicated on men's control over women's sexual purity to ensure their virginity before marriage and chastity thereafter. The language of purity of blood prevailed in Spanish colonial America well into the 19th century, but its symbolic meaning in colonial society began to shift by the mid-18th century. The Iberian doctrine of limpieza de sangre was unique in late medieval Europe as a legal and symbolic normative system which underwrote the pursuit of crimes against Christianity, principal among them Judaism and Islam, which was introduced in the peninsula at the dawn of modernity. We still don't know when and with what meaning the doctrine of purity of blood was introduced. In fact, that is an important issue for future research. Purity of blood was understood as the quality of having no ancestor who was a Moor, Jew, heretic, or penitenciado, someone condemned by the Inquisition. Iberian late medieval attitudes, justifications, and policies of social inclusion and exclusion were framed thus in religious cultural terms, and Margarita is going to talk about that as well, I think, not only of canon law, but of God's divine will, pure blood testifying genuine and unswavering Christian faith. The opposition between purity and impurity, which allowed for no gradation of spiritual purity, referred to moral qualities. Impure blood was understood as that which bore the indelible stain of descent from the Jews who killed Jesus Christ and the Muslims who refused to acknowledge Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Blood was thus conceived as a vehicle of purity of faith, according to which religious moral vices and virtues were transmitted from generation to generation. Blood purity was assessed by means of genealogical investigations, which sought to determine religious faith in a context in which Christianity, as the only true faith, was conceived as the ultimate source of meaning and knowledge about the order in society and the universe. A veritable obsession with genealogy as proof of descent from Christian ancestors through the generations placed a special onus on Christian women's sexual conduct as warranty of legitimate and pure Christian origin. In accordance with Christian precepts, conversion to Christianity as the only true faith could nonetheless redeem the stain that attached to non-believers. Through baptism, Jews and Muslims could become like Gentiles. Gentiles, Gentiles, as distinct from pagans, were genuine neophytes because they had been ignorant of God's laws before conversion. In the Spanish American colonies, the doctrine of limpieza de sangre continued to refer to a cultural religious quality into the 18th century. Scholars have nonetheless tended to interpret limpieza de sangre as an ideology of racial purity and exclusion from the beginning of colonization, race, ethnicity, and ethnic identity being employed as interchangeable terms in much of the literature on empire. Notable exceptions in this general tendency to conflate limpieza de sangre with race are Schwartz and Solomon, as well as Zuniga, who have recently insisted that the early colonial usage of a genealogical language of birth and blood to define social boundaries needs to be distinguished from modern racism, which made its appearance only in the 18th century, and Theo Goldberg referred to that. It is all but trivial to ascertain the symbolic meanings of the categories of social placement that developed in Spanish-American colonial society against the background of their metropolitan presidents for a number of reasons. First, historical analysis, when applying present cultural meanings to past times, runs the risk of anachronism and confusion. The categories of social placement I have examined not only underwrote the identification and treatment of the indigenous population of the African slaves together with their mixed offspring, and curtailed their chances for social improvement in particular ways, but they had immediate consequences for gender relations. To argue, as I do, that the doctrine of limpieza de sangre during the first 2 centuries after conquest was a cultural religious principle of social placement and discrimination makes the earlier social hierarchy of honors neither better nor worse morally than modern racism, only specific historically, and this is a political issue. Even when scholars use the controversial term race in a descriptive rather than analytical sense, this is historically misleading, for it sidesteps the fundamental question as to how American peoples understood social identity and exclusion in their own times, times in which theology explained the order and disorder in the world. Second, because the modes of social classification and identification that structure a society shape the way in which its social reproduction is organized, the symbolic meaning with which limpieza de sangre was endowed determined the manner in which conceptions and relationships between women and men were forged sociopolitically. As I want to argue, whenever social status is predicated on birth, blood, read descent, rather than individual socioeconomic achievement or merits, women and the control of their sexuality become decisive for men in their competition for social honors. For in this context, it is only women who can warrant socially adequate and legitimate birth. As the old adage goes, mater semper certa est, and fathers you can find in every corner. That's a combination with a Brazilian proverb. Madre hay una sola, padre en cada esquina. Finally, and that's not a fact of nature, it's a fact of history. Finally, to interpret any ideology that roots social quality and status in birth, genealogy, lineage, or descent as racialist would ultimately lead to the untenable conclusion that all pre-modern societies, especially those studied by anthropologists, lineage societies, were organized along racial lines. I think counterfactual thought sometimes is revealing. Patrilineal, matrilineal, bilateral societies determine a person's socio-political placement in so-called ethnographic societies, but they are not racist. Adherent ideas and ideals of social placement were almost immediately challenged in the New World. In the American colonies, the interplay between the metaphysics of blood and socioeconomic functions engendered a many-layered gradation of social positions instead of the strict polarity between pure and impure socio-religious status. Indigenous peoples, the invented Indians, did not fit easily into the cultural religious classificatory scheme of limpieza de sangre, and even less so the settlers' mixed and generally illegitimate offspring. Indians were formerly considered vassals of the crown, but they differed from Spanish conquerors and settlers in their belief systems which conflicted with Christian religious moral precepts. Eventually, it was argued that since Indians had been ignorant of the sacred scriptures, they were neophytes, They were regarded as dependent minors, similar to women, who depended on protection and guidance, that is, the control of their men. Indians, almas pequeñas, little souls, needed the tutelage of the crown and the church, who were responsible for instructing them in the only true Christian faith. As a Spanish royal decree established still in 1697, the Indians' purity of blood without mixture of infectious or another repudiated sect, end of quote, entitled them to all prerogatives, dignities, and honors which those possessing pure blood enjoyed in Spain. Schools ought to be established to teach them the Castilian language, and they ought to be evangelized. That is, in modern contemporary terms, they should be assimilated. In practice, the Indians' formal equality with Spaniards did not protect them, however, from brutal dispossession of their lands and their concentration in Indian towns, pueblos y indios, to better discipline and exploit them as forced labor. Even so, they were free people. The political-cultural status of African slaves in colonial society drew equally on metropolitan precedents. I guess it is known that, in fact, modern slavery was not invented in the Americas, but in Spain and Portugal, African slavery persisted until the 18th century. In contrast to the Indians, the enslavement of Africans was deemed perfectly legitimate. Their enslavement was not debated according to Aristotle's notion of natural slavery. It was taken for granted. On the Iberian Peninsula, African slavery persisted until the 18th century. The Africans introduced in the New World as slaves and their descendants were regarded as genuinely impure in their blood and infectious because they bore the taint of the ugly stain of the very vile birth of Sambos, mulattoes, and other worse castes, with whom men of the middling sphere feel ashamed to intermingle. This stain was due to their descent from the barbarous black Africans from Guinea, los negros de Guinea. This was the original idea of the enslavement on the peninsula, who were almost beyond the pale of civilization, that is, conversation to the only true faith. During the first 2 centuries after conquest, limpieza de sangre referred to cultural, religious rather than racial qualities. The modern category of race was adopted only in the 18th century. With both principles of social classification had in common, however, was that both rooted socio-political status in genealogy. Social hierarchy was based on lines of descent, though what was thought to be transmitted by blood changed from redeemable, moral, religious conduct and belief to innate social distinctions. The shift, which takes place in the late 70s, early 18th century, is also a shift, as Anthony Paquin has shown very rightly, I think, from a system of classification which is based on analogy to what extent are peoples close or distant from Christianity, to a new system of classification which tries to explain difference and generates hierarchy, which is a totally different way of conception. Because social position was thought to be determined first and foremost by genealogical origin, the reproductive norm in Iberian colonial society was endogamous marriage between equals in social status. Cada uno con su cada una, as it was said in 19th century Cuba. In their zeal to safeguard their social honors, cum blood purity, the colonial elites aspired to marry among themselves to assure social purity conditioned on the legitimate birth of their offspring. Under these circumstances, the lower orders could hardly marry otherwise. Sexual intercourse between partners of unequal status, which was not infrequent, usually occurred out of wedlock. The illegitimate offspring were excluded from the social honors of the better placed progenitor, who was usually the father, and raised in the households headed by their low-status mothers. Again, I think the Cuadros de Castas don't depict that phase of the colonial order, woman-headed households, which were quite frequent. The colonial elites reproduced the Metropolitan Honor Code, which made their pursuit of purity dependent on a sexual morality in which the virginity and chastity of women stood out as a paramount value, adapting it to the new colonial environment. This link between social purity and female sexual virtue was manifest in a gender ideology which endowed men with the right and responsibility to control their women's bodies and sexuality. This was so precisely because an individual's social value, rather than being something acquired through actions or behavior, depended primordially on his or her genealogical antecedents. Men could gain social honors through heroic deeds, but they needed to follow the honor code not to lose them later, whereas women could only lose their honor virtue, their sexual honor virtue. The Iberian and colonial American kinship system was bilateral. This is very important, with children tracing their descent through both parents and understood as related to the consanguineous kin of both parents in the same way. Because genealogical origin was traced bilaterally, marriage between social equals played the central role in perpetuating social honors. In the case of offspring of mixed unions, it was nonetheless always the socially inferior parent, regardless of sex, who determined the child's status. Because of the importance that was attributed to women's sexual virtue for family honor, it was inconceivable for an elite woman to marry, or even worse, to entertain a sexual union with a man of lesser social purity, for this would have contaminated her entire family. Hence, mixed sexual encounters were usually hypergamous between upper-class men and women of lower status. It needs to be emphasized, however, that in spite of the social weight of genealogy in determining social status, colonial society was never a closed, impermeable, hierarchical order. By the 18th century, Spanish colonial society had become a complex and fluid gradation of inequalities. This was the result by now of the interplay between modern criteria of class and race. Legitimate marriage and birth were not only proof of the moral quality of the progenitors, but purity of blood had acquired new prominence because of the mixed offspring of sporadic sexual unions and concubinage of Europeans and Creoles with Indian or mestizo women, as well as those of African background, had by now blurred visible group boundaries, and the aspirations of upward social mobility was felt by the elites to threaten their social preeminence and privileges. The cuadros de castas are symptomatic, I think, of the acute social sensibilities which 3 centuries of mestizaje, instead of diminishing, had only served to intensify. In this context of social fluidity and instability, the language of limpieza de sangre gained new relevance, while it lost its earlier religious moral connotation and acquired a racial meaning instead. I emphasized, or I insisted on, the value attached to women's sexuality, but it must be stressed that in the increasingly dynamic social process in the colonial society, two kinds of women emerged. The women of the elite, called hijas de familia, whose family controlled their conduct, their moral conduct and their sexuality, and the women, of mixed descent, mestizas, mulatas, and so on. The famous image of the mulata, which persists until today in Cuba or in Brazil, as quintessentially sexually attractive seducer, and therefore exempting white men for falling into for their charms. That is to say, another kind of women who were considered not to possess family who had any honor, and therefore were permanent objects for the sexual advances of upper-class white men. A 19th century proverb in Cuba had it that no hay tamarindo dulce ni mulata señorita, which is extraordinarily cruel. There's no sweet tamarind fruit, nor a virgin mulata woman. To account for the shift in the symbolic meaning of blood purity to race, we have to look once again to Europe. And here I think we need to talk. In Europe, the spread of modern individualism, which accompanied the decline of monarchy, brought about new theories of how individuals might be linked together by their natural character. We have talked about the emerging natural philosophy, natural history. In late 17th century Europe, experimental natural philosophy sought to discover the natural laws that govern the human condition, and abandoned the earlier theological ontology. After the publication of the works by William Petty, this is still late 17th century, Edward Tyson and Carl Linnaeus, early 18th century, on the order in nature, humankind was no longer a perfect, divinely created whole, but was split into 2, 3, if not more grades of human beings, breed races. The naturalist concern was with human beings as physical creatures and as members of organized societies. The emphasis was no longer on human unity, but on physical and cultural differences. This interest in plural kinds of human beings was to resonate down the generations in treatises and tomes on racial and social theory. Now, I have found an earlier racial classification, and I think we'll have to continue searching to periodize properly. An anonymous article published in France in the Journal des Savants, the journal of the wise people or the scholars, of 1684, sees one of the first uses of the concept of race in a sense that comes close to its modern meaning. Its author distinguished, and I quote, 4 or 5 species of races of men, which he differentiated by their anthropological traits, central among them skin color and their geographical habitat, although he hesitated to conceive of American Indians as a race apart. The Journal des Savants was among the principal European scholarly journals. This article, I think, was a sign of the times. Incidentally, this new notion of race developed parallel to the new bisexual model, which held that the uterus naturally disposes women toward maternity and domesticacy. This can be found in Thomas Laqueur, Making Sex, which is a history of models of the sexual anatomy of human beings from the classical Greeks to the 18th century. And I think this is a very interesting coincidence and intersection. It is difficult to tell when exactly this new notion of race made its passage to the New World, but there is no doubt that it did, not least due to the colonial elite's heightened anxiety over their genealogical purity. Despite its new racial meaning, the language of the less tangible quality of black purity persisted in the Iberian colonies. I think because phenotype had by the 18th century become a rather unreliable sign of a person's genealogical background. And what became also increasingly relevant as evidence of a person's purity of blood, by now race, were the registrations in the books of baptism, which actually classified people. There were books for whites and books for pardos y morinos. So this was a way of legally determining a person's blood color. And finally, a last point, we have mentioned, and my predecessors have been mentioning, the Bourbon Reforms. Charles III and his son, the modernization, the expropriation of church lands on the peninsula, and so on. But I think there is a further innovation which needs to be stressed in this context. It is quite surprising that precisely Charles Carlos III, the progressive king, enacts also the first law regulating marriage. Until then, the church had the jurisdiction over marriage, and the principal practice by the church was absolute freedom of marriage. They were opposed against parental descent with marriage, arguing that marriage is fundamental to guarantee the salvation of people's souls, that is to say, the control of the body for the good of the salvation of the soul, particularly of women. It is by the mid-18th century that Charles III reduces the church's jurisdiction in terms of charity and also in terms of property, the transmission of property, inheritance, and introduces the famous pragmática sanción contra matrimonios desiguales, the pragmatic sanction against unequal marriages. This pragmatic sanction is introduced, promulgated in 1776, and made extensive to the colonies in 1778, with the argument that, of course, in the colonies, the regulation and the control of unions, of marriages, is so much more important because of the extraordinary diversity and inequality of the peoples which inhabit the islands. A last bit of thought: it is not surprising that liberalizing political regime should, through the back door, reintroduce precisely fundamental controls, patrimony through matrimony, at a time when the upcoming Enlightenment, also the French Revolution, was having resonances in Spain. But in Spain, the application of the pragmatic was really minor. It became absolutely fundamental in the colonies, and then particularly in 19th century Cuba, the pearl of the Caribbean after the independence of the mainland colonies. Thank you very much.